Francis Stroh. Beer Money by Francis Stroh, a memoir of privilege and loss. I don't really feel like reading this, but started it, so I might as well finish it. And so I will. I'll say that I'm 2/3 through the book, and let's get on with it. Let's get on with it. We're on page 192, and we got to go to 312, so basically 120 pages left. Let's see what this says. Elisa Keys, 1996, by Eric Stroh. Nearly a year later, on a soggy November night, I left my Fulham flat and made my way to the Ritz to meet my father and Elisa. Wait, is that the girl that she went to high school with? I think it is. The tube was stale with unwashed commuters and the damp of the still night air. I came out of the station at New Bond Street wearing the only decent dress and jacket I had in London, feeling waif-like next to the chic, coiffed mannequins lording it over every single shop's window. The Ritz stood in the distance in all its cheesy extravagance. Would she be familiar? Elisa, I wondered. I think you'll like her, my father had said several times over the phone. You two have a lot in common. I had no idea what to expect. Elisa was a former classmate of Francis Stroh at Grosse Point, maybe North School, wherever they're going, South School. And her father, no, his name's not Peter, is it? Whatever her father's name was, he was part of the Stroh Brewery Company, and her mother had divorced her father, which I think is named Peter. I could be wrong though. And he met her at one of the bars he drank at after the divorce. Of course, this was after the mother remarried. He had hung around with the mother for a while, even though he was forced out of the family home. And then he met this classmate of Francis Stroh, former classmate. I think she's in her 30s now, so she's about a decade and a half after high school. Between completing a series of installations, finishing my MA program, and signing a lease for a shared art studio with a group from Chelsea College, I'd been too busy to engage much with family matters. I'd managed to keep my promise to myself, mostly steering clear of romantic relationships, although the difficulties I'd experienced with British men had certainly aided me in this goal. From what I could tell, no one actually dated in London. They just got drunk at a pub, stumbled home, and shagged. The Brits' romantic side, such as it was, expressed itself through a cultural phenomenon that seemed unique to them: unrequited love. In England, everyone pined for someone, a lost love, a married love, or some other form of the impossible, and I was no exception. While at Chelsea, I'd become infatuated first with Trevor and then with an artist who taught in the MA program, John Hilliard. And yet we were only friends. We often met at gallery openings and afterward would occasionally go to his house for a drink, or I'd put one of my favorite Bob Dylan albums on the record player. The times they are a changin'. John was the last person I knew with a cherished and unironic vinyl collection, all alphabetized, substantially older than I, and with a successful, though in truth I found him at least as, substantially older than I, and with a successful international career as an artist, John seemed a role model, though in truth I found him at least as hip as any of my actual contemporaries. We'd sit on his Italian sofa and talk about art, film, bands, about all the people we knew who were doing noteworthy things. And yet, as with so many men I'd met in London, John maintained a flirtatious remove that was unsettling, and I began to suspect that my unrequited feelings might simply be part of the cultural soup in which I found myself. I was learning to speak a new language, the language of calibrated distance, with the hope that our carefully monitored exchanges would somehow lead to more closeness. In spite of how lonely this was, my life would undoubtedly have appeared to the outside observer rather glamorous, full of parties, dinners, gallery openings, and interesting friends. Life moved quickly in London, and with all the distraction I'd found, one could easily spend a year or two, or five, and still be alone. Well, at least she wasn't a whore. And so a part of me felt relieved that my father wasn't alone. Though I spoke with him less frequently since Elisa had entered the picture, I realized his preoccupation was a recognizable sign of happiness. My grandmother, whom I badly missed, was the only family member with whom I spoke regularly. The rest had gradually stopped calling to report on my father's comings and goings. But when my father called in October to say he was bringing Elisa all the way to London just to meet me, I knew things must be serious. Stepping into the hotel, I recognized Elisa immediately. She and my father were sitting on a round silk sofa beneath an enormous crystal chandelier at the center of the lobby. Christ, I said to myself, it's Eat the Rich. In high school, I had never known her actual name. I remembered standing outside a heavy glass door by the school's parking lot with the smokers cracking jokes between drags and getting laughs from the crowd gathered there. Elisa among them. She wore the same clothes every day, a moth eaten army fatigue jacket with the words Eat the Rich embroidered on the back, in fiery sweeps of red and blue. Her suede lace up moccasins just reached the knees. You could see exposed through shredded holes in her jeans. Her deep voice and towering height would have deemed her an important member of the crowd, though I rarely heard her speak. She seemed always to be lurking in the hallways or striding angrily across the school's lawns as if chased by tiny devils with blazing pitchforks. And the emblazoned message, my father waved me over, and I felt my legs propel me forward with involuntary momentum. The girl's style had certainly changed. I thought to myself, taking in her fitted tweed suit, nude stockings, and brown tasseled loafers, a single strand of pearls around her rather thick neck. My lips strained. What a nice compliment. Her thick neck. My lips strained into a smile. I watched her eyes. They were, I saw, the eyes of a cornered animal. Was she hoping I wouldn't remember her? Though both of us were nervous, clearly I felt worse for Elisa somehow. My father stood up smiling and leaned toward me for a hug, his pipe clenched between his teeth. Hello, Franny, he said with determined cheer. I like your hair. As Elisa stood up and shook my hand, I did my best to put her at ease with friendly chatter, and I continued with this as we made our way toward the dining room. Quite a town, London, she said, surprising me with her ability to make small talk. How'd you like living here? Her voice was that same mannish, deep tenor I remembered from a decade or so ago. Her clothes really were the only remarkable change, and the fact she had aged the way drinkers do, red faced, lined eyes, a little big around the middle, don't much like big cities myself. Really, I said, I love it. But that's great, she grinned. What do you do here, anyway? Hadn't my father told her? I'm an installation artist, I said. Really? Sounds like fun. I cringed at what sounded like a somewhat condescending tone. Did she even have any idea what an installation artist was? My father stopped and fumbled in his breast pocket for a lighter. Elisa reached into her handbag and smoothly produced a purple bic to relight his pipe. Goddamn limey tobacco, my father mumbled as we came into the fancy dining room. Whole country's damp. We spent the day at Dunhill's, Elisa told me with a proprietary indulgence. He's trying out a new tobacco. Just like old times, I said. Dad and I used to spend the whole day at Dunhill's sometimes when I was a child. Unsure how to continue, I looked over to my father, just then busy with the maitre d' His spending the day with Elisa at one of our old haunts felt like a betrayal, and I sensed this would be the first of many times I'd feel this way. Back in high school, I remembered hearing once that Elisa had been in a car wreck with her mother, and that her mother had died. A fact that had elicited my respect and some deference in matters of suffering, though I couldn't have imagined then that our separate longings for a parent would one day collide. Soon we were seated at a round table at the center of the dining room. Our French waiter was one of the most handsome men I'd ever seen, and his flirtatious attention helped distract me. Still, I caught myself realizing as the drinks were served that Elisa, who'd been something of a wallflower back in high school, seemed determined to assert her new authority with assurance. So, do you get paid for that? She said, the installation stuff. My father sat smiling complacently as he nursed his vodka and ginger ale, a drink I hadn't seen in his hand in 10 years, seemingly happy that Elisa and I were getting along, probably telling himself that all his worries about the introduction had been for naught. I wasn't sure which I found more disturbing, the fact my father was drinking again, or that he'd brought that girl from the smoking exit all the way to London. The two events seemed fundamentally connected. In a sense, yes. I do get paid, I told Elisa. I came here on a grant, see? I sipped my wine and hoped she wouldn't ask me what precisely installation meant. She took a mini baguette from her plate and tore off a bite with her teeth. So, what is installation anyway? Can they make me a hamburger? I heard my father asking our waiter as he gestured toward the kitchen. Well done, please. Elisa poured herself a glass of wine before the waiter had time to come around to our side of the table. The waiter took the bottle from her hand and finished pouring. She smiled at my father, who wheezed through the smoke as he lit his cigarette. He looked tired. Installation art, I told her. Well, it defies boundaries or strict definition, really. So it could be anything. I suppose it could. Francis is a damn good photographer, my father said. I wish you'd get the old camera out more often. I smiled and lifted my glass of wine. Cheers, I said, and we all toasted. To what exactly, I was not sure. My father and Elise had come over on the Queen Elizabeth II and would return on the Concorde. My father was rolling out the red carpet for Eat the Rich, and all I could do was drink my wine and act as if this were all perfectly normal. Elisa and I shared a bottle of Cabernet while my father sipped his vodka. After dinner, my father retired to bed, and Elisa and I went out to a nearby nightclub for a drink, her idea. My father chuckled, waving us off through the closing elevator door. Don't make it too late, girls. The club was very West London, posh, low lit, ritzy, and full of sexy, well dressed people out to be seen. Cool place, Elisa said, not without a certain discomfort in her voice. Installing ourselves at the long lacquered bar, trying hard to be heard over the portishead, blaring in surreal, hypnotic waves, we ordered scotches on the rocks. The bartender scrutinized us as he poured. Was he trying to make out our relationship? Elisa took a long draw from her drink, emptying half the glass. We talked about people we'd both known in high school and what had become of them, although in truth there wasn't a lot of overlap beyond the smoking exit. You knew Caitlin Jaspers? Asked Elisa, right? The bar was filling up, and I knew it had to be around midnight. Of course. My mind flashed to the pale, impossibly beautiful girl in Hobie's back seat, her thick black hair blowing around as we headed to the Uniroyal plant. She's really been through hell, said Elisa. A while back, she told me, Caitlin had gotten out of the car one night at the side of the freeway after a fight with her boyfriend, then was badly beaten by someone who came out of nowhere. By the time her boyfriend came back to get her, she was being loaded into an ambulance. Her face had to be totally reconstructed. I found the story so upsetting I felt physically ill. Oh my God, was all I could say. Yeah, it was really bad, continued Elisa. You might not recognize her now. But she got married, you know. Now she's teaching photography or something at a high school in Maine. I found even this happy ending depressing. I'd imagined so much more for Caitlin. A glitzy career as a Rolling Stone magazine staff photographer, rock star boyfriends she'd stub out like cigarettes as soon as she grew bored, a wardrobe that would put Kate Moss to shame. Damn, I said, I'm just floored, I guess. Caitlin deserves so much better. I know, Elisa nodded toward the back of the club. Hold on, I'll be right back. I had thought about Caitlin often since high school. I'd last seen her 10 years before at a Beastie Boys concert at St. Andrews Hall in Detroit. She was photographing the band for a magazine spread. The glamorous life I'd envisaged seemed well underway, and then apparently it had all come apart. Or had she just realized she didn't need all the lights? Didn't I myself have some of the same doubts? As flamboyant a partygoer as I could be, the truth was I liked the quiet life of making art, talking about art, and enjoying close friends at dinner parties. The kind of life I'd been having in London for the most part. Those evenings I spent out among the art stars at private views and parties, they weren't the most memorable, the ones I truly cherished. Elisa weaved through the dancers on her way back from the restroom, making a goofy show of using her handbag as a front fender to ward off collisions. I'm still speechless, I said as she sat down. Yeah, she studied me, her eyes widening in the dim light. Not to change the subject or anything, but go ahead, I told her. I've been feeling really sorry for your dad. He's a good man, but, he never got any love. Her voice cracked on the word love. You're right, I said guardedly. I wasn't sure where she was going with this, but I had the distinct feeling I was being rather purposefully led. He got shortchanged, I guess, as a kid. See, so did I, she said, downing the rest of her drink. I know what it means to basically be an orphan. I'm going to make up all those lost years to your dad, though, you know? Give him everything he never got. You'll see. My stomach tightened into a thorny little ball. She was going to parent him? As much as I wanted to believe this, the age difference between them had already spelled things out pretty clearly. Elisa would be the pampered child. My father had already told me they slept in separate bedrooms and that he gave her a large monthly allowance. That's a pimp move. Besides, I had my doubts that anyone could make up the losses of childhood with another person's affection. I'd been my own lab rat, and the data was not encouraging. Do you really think it works that way? Elisa nodded slowly, considering her next move. He's like a lost little kid. He needs someone. He should have been a photographer, I said. It's funny, she said, resting her elbow on the bar. That's exactly what he always says about you. Gorgeous people swayed all around us to the heroin beat of Massive Attack. A couple fell against the bar in a cinematic embrace, one of her long earrings coming unhooked as she swatted flirtatiously at his drunk, groping hands. Elisa lit a cigarette, and I saw her, 11 years before, huddled in the corner of the smoking exit, laughing at my jokes, but perhaps afraid to speak. The snow blowing around us in sub-zero gusts. Non-specific location. Number 1, 1996 by Francis Stroh. Oh my god. How much more of this bullshit about London? My shared art studio in southeast London had a large window facing a block of boarded up storefronts and crumbling pre-war brick warehouses. I often paused on the windowsill in the afternoon to absorb some heat from the old radiator beneath it. Looking out, there were no trees anywhere, even on the vacant lots. The brown grime covered every surface, of ancient coal dust or an eternity of exhaust fumes. The very people milling about outside seemed to have absorbed it into their drab clothing, their worn-out shoes. I was working on a new idea, rudimentary remakes of famous film scenes. So far I had made just one, the scene in Apocalypse Now where the helicopter lands on the beach and blows everyone's stuff away. I had reconstructed the beach on a large rectangular table using sand and cocktail umbrellas, then simulated the flight of a helicopter by coming down onto the beach with the video camera and a hairdryer blowing from behind it. The effect, with the addition of an audio track of a helicopter in flight, was magnificently absurd, especially as all the umbrellas blew away one by one. I hadn't been able to think of any other movie scenes I wanted to recreate. We had an open studio show coming up in early December, only 1 month away, and we're committed to exhibiting at least one installation. All week, while I've been busy showing my father and Elisa around London, my studio mates had been hard at work on their pieces. My father was so jazzed on Elisa he hadn't even remembered to suggest a studio visit to see my work. Then my flat was robbed, tying me up for days at the American Embassy, where I'd gone to replace my stolen passport. The thief had also taken the Nikon camera and lenses my father had given me in high school, all my personal photos, and some cheap jewelry. So you were burgled, were you? The police officer exclaimed when I'd called to report the break in. But they never came out to investigate. George Orwell, I figured, had the British attitude down. Property itself was theft, which was clearly why I'd been relieved of mine. Case closed. By my father and Elisa's last day in London, I was eager for them to board their Concorde, if only so I could get my life back. It had been 2 weeks since I was in the studio. On the very last day, while Elisa had a massage at the hotel, my father and I went to see the Degas exhibit at the National Gallery. Standing before the 100th painting of ballerinas, I pictured lining them all up on the beach and gunning them down. I knew I could get the soundtrack of a machine gun somewhere, and music box figurines of ballerinas were plentiful. Perhaps my idea needed some evolving. I wouldn't limit my imagination to scenes from movies. Perhaps anything was fair game. My father grunted at the paintings and wandered off. I trailed behind him, passing a tall ballerina sculpture. He looked shrunken beside her proud, lithe stance on the pedestal. His shoulders caved forward. He was getting old. I wanted to reach out and hug him through his khaki raincoat, but I didn't. The day before, we'd been at Harrods, where my father had bought Elisa a leather backpack costing £400. Afterward, while they looked on uncomfortably, I tried on a pair of earrings that cost £100. My father seemed torn, with Elisa watching, between pulling out his credit card and letting me buy them myself. It occurred to me then that any friendship that might form between Elisa and me would be contrived only for my father's sake. As I admired the gold earrings in the mirror, Elisa ruffled the tissue paper in her enormous Harrods shopping bag. The tension was stifling. My father wheezed through his cigar smoke, wondering out loud where we should have lunch. Finally, I pulled out my own credit card and handed it to the sales clerk. My Fulbright extension had just ended, and I could hardly afford the earrings. But I wanted to show my father that I could take care of myself, even as I was beginning to wonder if it was true. Later, when Elisa was seated at the hotel bar downing yet another drink, my father led me into the lobby and gave me an envelope containing £400. Happy birthday, he said. Maybe get yourself a new camera. It was an apology, and I felt grateful for it, though the money was, I knew, a booby prize. I spent every penny of the gift on black cabs to and from gallery private views instead of taking the tube, a luxury I rarely allowed myself. The money lasted just 2 weeks until my 30th birthday had passed. I knew I was being reckless with my father's money, reckless the way he was, and this somehow calmed me. Elisa and I are engaged, my father announced over the phone just 1 week after their Concorde flight had touched down in New York. I sat down on my futon sofa and studied the chips in my thrift store coffee table. That's great, Dad. And look, you don't have to worry. We'll be signing a prenup. Bill Penner's drawing one up. I'm not worried about that. I hadn't even considered it. In fact, but felt reassured just the same, knowing that Bill Penner, the family lawyer, would handle the matter well. I hope you'll come to the wedding in the spring. Of course, I said. And I'm inviting you kids to join us out in Jackson Hole after Christmas. My treat. Wow, thanks. We hadn't been on a family vacation since I was a teenager. But Charlie would be excluded from the trip, I knew, and I wasn't sure I was ready for the family politics, particularly now. Can I let you know as we get closer? Of course. I felt surprisingly unburdened as I hung up the phone. With this frightful thing actually happening, there was at least one less catastrophe to fend off. I even felt happy for my father, remembering how Elisa had smiled at him at dinner, lit his pipe for him, laughed at his awful barroom jokes. She had a few of her own to share too. Maybe it made a kind of sense, this odd May December match. The birds on the brick wall outside my conservatory chirped in the smog. A fake sounding British siren bellowed down Wandsworth Bridge Road. Soon I'd go over to the Indian liquor store to buy my bottled water, and on my way home I'd stop to chat with the furniture makers who rented the storefront below me. What did it matter what went on in Michigan? I don't like your attitude, bitch. With just 2 weeks left to conceive and finish an installation, I still hadn't decided what I'd present in the studio show. Usually I would spend months on a new piece. Knowing now that this effort would be rushed, I was reluctant to invite Trevor Atkins or any of the art dealers. Trevor, who was moonlighting as a guest curator, had put some of my British friends into a show at the Hayward Gallery, but not me. When I'd run into him at a gallery private view in early November and asked him about his decision, he'd said, "It's a survey of British artists, Francis. Nothing personal, but it did feel personal, particularly after Trevor Trevor's enthusiasm during my final MA exhibition at Chelsea back in September. The buzz from the visiting art dealers and critics had also been encouraging. Lisson Gallery and Interim Art had made special studio visits to preview my work. A mere 2 months later, Trevor was putting safe and mostly male British art stars into the Hayward Gallery show, and the art dealers, too, were radio silent. I began to wonder if I was too much of an outlier as an American artist. When a well known British artist offhandedly suggested I keep my contacts active in the States, just in case my suspicions solidified, I began to believe that coming to London had been a grave misstep in my career. I should move to New York, I decided. Then again, the thought of establishing myself in yet another big city was exhausting, to say nothing of the expense. With my Fulbright income gone, I needed a teaching job in a college art department. The small income I received from our real estate trust in Detroit, while helpful, was not nearly enough to live on. I began to have fantasies of escaping the drudgery of life in London to some whitewashed village in Greece. There I could build up reserves, both emotional and financial. Before my next move, with my momentum in London all but exhausted, I often forewent the hour-long tube ride to the studio to work on a piece for the upcoming show. Instead, I became involved with projects around the house, like applying for studio programs in New York, or vacuuming, or polishing camera lenses, the used ones I'd bought to replace the stolen lenses. At last, I arrived at an idea for the studio show, a life size video projection of a poker game. It was part of a series of happenings that I filmed from the ceilings of rooms and then projected, often back into the very spaces where the events had been recorded. Having spent the afternoon at the studio setting up for the shoot, I pulled a rectangular table into the center of the room, climbed on top, and attached my video camera to the ceiling. Then I spent an hour adjusting the angle of the camera, observing the image of the tabletop on a monitor, lining the edges up with the frame. With the show only a few days away, an oppressive mood had settled over the studio. Dispirited, Mike and Oli tinkered for hours with a broken video projector. Tanya came over from across the hall to use our bathroom, but didn't stop to talk. Gary sat at his desk, ignoring everyone. My poker playing friends were due at any moment, but then the phone rang and I went over to answer. It was my brother Bobby. So Dad eloped with that thing. I didn't know whether to laugh at this or cry. I leaned into the wide windowsill, observing the desolation of the street outside. Dead grass studding the empty lot beyond, like patches of mold on the old bread. On old bread, tiny flecks of rain blew sideways through the air. Where? I said. At Groon's, the redneck guitar store in Nashville. I knew it well, the store. My father spent tens of thousands there each year buying vintage Martin guitars and selling others back for pennies on the dollar. I thought he was going to invite us to a wedding or something. Well, he was with Elisa and Ginger Boatwright, and they all got drunk and threw an impromptu wedding. No prenup, nothing. Bingo, right? Mom is fucking pissed. Ginger was a buxom and soulful bluegrass singer, a friend whose career my father had probably subsidized. She herself had wanted to marry him at one point, but he must have been holding out for a young thing like Alyssa. Hanging up the phone, I felt as if a truckload of wet concrete had just been dumped on top of me. I wondered how I'd make it through the shoot. I walked back to the set and adjusted some floodlights among the poker table. Neither Mike nor Gary looked up from his work. Ole watched me silently for a moment, then returned to the broken projector. The old radiators began to kick out some heat, and the room grew warm with the comforting smell of scorched dust. On the day of the studio show, I stood at the center of the exhibition room, observing my piece for the first time. Just a color projection of poker chips and cards, with hands manipulating them on a tabletop. No sound. With its banal subject matter and a lack of implicit critique, the piece came across as nothing more than itself. Rather than enlarging the experience, the all seeing eye of the camera had reduced it, and I was relieved no one mentioned it to me, either during or after the private view, which attracted over 100 friends in art world types. In the disappointment of the show, I couldn't help but feel the tide had permanently turned for me in London. If the proverbial club sandwich had ever been there, it certainly wasn't anymore. And I no longer felt deserving of success anyway. My flat was a warm, safe cave in which to hibernate through another London winter, and I stayed home for days, subsisting like my mother on cream of tomato soup from cans and sleeping too much. The answering machine picked up my messages with the volume turned all the way down. My clothes sat in piles on the floor. It seemed I was losing everything all at once, my father, my family, what I'd hoped to be my career, so many blows in so short a time, and that legacy of failure I thought I'd left behind in the States. It had not only caught up, it had overtaken me. I wasn't the favored one anymore, not anywhere, and it felt like a kind of death, as shameful as it seemed to even think this way. One day when the phone rang, I decided to answer it. Francis, said my father, will you be coming home for Christmas? I don't know, Dad. Sudden tears burned my cheeks raw. I'm just, really, really busy here. What's wrong? He said. Nothing, I told him, and we talked instead about the weather and the beer business, avoiding entirely the matter of his marriage. Elisa, I figured, would be right there in the room beside him, downing a beer or firing up a smoke. I had to choose my topics carefully. Now I would be the one hovering in the shadows, afraid to speak. The absurdity of the thought made me smile for the first time in days. I was stretched out on John Hilliard's sofa in furry leopard pants. John, who lately had taken on something of a fatherly role, sat in the chair to my left, talking over my future with me, red wine and crackers laid out on the table. Between us, all around us, printed on enormous canvases, were John's famous photographs, resting against the tables and walls. I adored my friend's house, formerly the vicarage of an Anglican church, with its Gothic arches and minimalist decor. London can really work for you if you give it some time. He sipped his glass of Cabernet. Make 3 more of the inkjet prints, why don't you, and invite the galleries over to your studio. As part of my final exhibition at Chelsea, I made a 9 by 9 foot color print, a partial aerial shot of an unidentified town in the north of England, enlarged and sumptuously printed on vinyl, then mounted on stretcher bars in the manner of a painting, much like John's work. He had assisted me in stretching the canvas, an all-day undertaking, and the print had been the focus of much attention during the exhibit. Now it was rolled up in a closet at my studio collecting dust. I knew John believed in me the way I'd once believed in myself, but it felt too late somehow. I just couldn't rally any more optimism around the prints, or in fact much of anything. Those prints cost £800 a piece to make, I said dismissively. There was no way I could afford 3 more. Instead, I was working on another video installation, panning my camera across still images of landscapes I'd found in books. Edited together, the effect was that of a view from a train window, a dizzying assemblage of nameless places passing by. Only I was finding that gaining perspective on false constructs was a far simpler feat in art than in life itself. In life, the false constructs themselves tended to take over. Anyway, I'm going home for Christmas, I told John. A kind of masochistic curiosity had seized me, and I booked an airline ticket. Maybe I'll make those prints after I get back, I added, though I knew I wouldn't. I could feel something closing off inside of me, the drive to make pieces waning, and well before I'd gotten the recognition I'd so badly wanted. Being in favor had always been my mode of survival, and later, the brittle foundation on which I'd built my creative life, my independence. Now, though, all that had changed. I needed to find something else to lean on. There she is. A mole on her neck. 1996. Or is that a beauty mark? Dispossessed will be next. What are we at? 37 minutes here? Right! All right, then. That's that.